Well, do you want to get started, and I'll just keep letting people in as they arrive?
Sure, yeah.
Okay, well, most of you already know me, but I'm Lizzie Barry. I'm the head librarian at Belmont Hills. And I'm really excited that Una Mannion is here tonight to talk with us and staying up past her bedtime to hang out with us, because she is 5 hours away in Ireland. And she is going to start out by just reading a little selection from her novel that just came out, that takes place right around where we all live.
Yeah, so I'm going to read just a really, really short piece from the very beginning. And just to, for anyone who hasn't read the novel, it's the last day of school at the very start of the summer holidays, and a family are driving home, a mother with her 5 kids, and they're squabbling in the back. The father is deceased, and as the kids squabble, the mother gets increasingly frustrated. And this is sort of a catalyst moment in the book. So I'll just read from just for about a minute and a half. The car skidded onto the shoulder right where 252 crossed the turnpike. Out, get out. My mom said it with her voice low, which let us know she meant it. Ellen reached across Thomas, opened the back door, and started to climb out. You can't leave her out here, Marie said. It's getting dark. I'm going with her. She started to gather her school bag from the floor of the front. You'll do no such thing. Wait, said Thomas. He looked stricken, blaming himself for the teasing. Ellen was standing on the gravel verge of the overpass in her school pinafore, tennis shirt, and knee socks. Marie was opening her door when my mother threw the car into gear and accelerated forward. I looked back. Ellen was facing away from us, looking down over the bridge where columns of cars funneled along the turnpike. Mom, don't, please, Thomas said, but she didn't answer. We sped up 252 into the national park and then turned west toward Valley Forge Mountain, where we lived. Ahead of us, the sun had fallen below the fields. You can't leave her. It's dark, Marie said. We were still 5 or 6 miles from home. I hadn't said anything to make my mother stop. We careened down the road, went through the covered bridge, past farmland and fences. Beside us, the shadows of dogwoods blurred in the dark as my mother kept driving, each tree hemmed in a halo of white where the bracts had fallen. Lizzie, I think you're muted. Sorry.
I was trying to keep the cat from making noises. I think there's kind of a mixture here of people who have read the book and who haven't, but I had some just a couple questions I wanted to start out with, and then if anyone else has any questions as well, we can just kind of chat. But just a sort of introductory question. A Crooked Tree is your first novel, but you've been writing for a long time. Can you just talk a little bit about your life and your writing career?
Yeah, I probably haven't been writing that long, and really only writing since my late 40s. So I think I've always been, I studied English literature at Sewanee in Tennessee, where Margaret, who's here, also went. And it's where the Sewanee Review is published. And I think when I was there, I think probably more than high school, I think when I got to college, I was sort of in awe, or, you know, of writing and being introduced to literature. But I don't think I really ever thought that writing was something that I could do. And I think I still had that idea of it being a club, you know, a special club or something, or mystified it. And when I came to Ireland initially, I was working, I worked on a journal actually with a writer who's now deceased, called Dermot Healy, but who is a very well-known writer in Ireland. And we did these interviews where we would go around and interview people with just a pen and pad of paper and a pen, and try and get like spoken word interviews. So you would talk to them for an hour. It might be a traditional musician or an artist or just a local character. And the first time I ever really had a sense of like crafting was when I would you'd come home with this pad of paper and you'd have all of this information and starting to just, I suppose, make a structure out of the interview. And it was the closest thing I'd done to writing, but I really, really loved that. And I after that, I worked in a lot of journals. I was a poetry editor, did an MA and a PhD in English, but I still hadn't been writing. And I don't know if any of you have ever done those morning papers where, you know, you wake, I think it's called From the Artist's Way, where you wake up each morning and you try to write for 30 minutes. And I used to do that religiously. And in 2013, I found my morning papers from the late 90s and then from the like 2003. And all of them were the same thing. Like, I want to write, I wish I would write. And I just thought, like, this is like, if I'm going to carry the grief of this around with me for the rest of my life if I don't write. And so I signed up for I joined a writing group down in Galway, and I drove every Monday night 2 hours down to Galway and met this group of people and wrote my first story. And so from there I suppose I was writing short stories and some poetry and got really lucky. You know, I got published, and I think just from the moment I started, I just never wanted to stop doing that. And even though it's torture to arrive at the chair some days, there's nothing else I'd rather be doing, if that makes sense. You know, I do feel like when I, you know, had, it's the one thing I've done in my life where it feels so satisfying, even though I'm never satisfied with a story or a book. You know, I never think it's done or right, or, but there's something very satisfying in it. So getting the novel published was like really, I think for people who are interested in writing, like entering competitions, I'd entered a few competitions that were judged by a woman who was she edits the book show in Ireland, and she has an agent. She'd be like, her agent is Ishiguro's agent and based in London, and she sent him my work, and he rang me and said, I really like the voice of your stories, but I'm interested in your novel. I heard you're working on a novel, and can I read it? And at that point, it was like November or late October. And he said, when can I read it? I said, January. So it was like 17-hour days, you know? And I sent it, and he signed me, which was so like a serendipity, really. I got very lucky. You know, I didn't have to go around to agents, or I never wrote that novel synopsis letter or agent letter. You know, I got an agent, and luckily, you know, they were able to sell the book in the States as well as in the UK. It's a very long answer, Lizzie. Sorry. So.
No, that's really fascinating. That's great. So, okay, so my next question was, sorry, my questions are kind of long-winded too. So you, like I said, you can like take as much or little as you want to answer from them. But there's a quote on the back of the book from Liz Moore, who I think is also from Philadelphia.
So, I have her book right here, so ironic.
Oh, yeah.
I'm using it to prop up. I'm using it to prop up the, the screen. Yeah.
But I thought it was particularly compelling. It says, this is a novel about the way adults fail children, but also about the moment that a child first understands that the adults around her are human, and the empathy that comes with that realization. And I was thinking, it seems like to me that description really describes like the process of coming of age, which is basically all the reviews of your book are saying it's a coming of age novel. It's a coming of age novel. So I was just curious, is that a process you were thinking about while you were writing? And did you have any other truths that you wanted to show Libby realizing as she went through this summer of her teenage years?
Yeah, I really loved that quote from Liz Moore, actually, because I do think that I was really interested in how children shoulder um, the cares or responsibilities of adults often, and will often protect adults, um, and and sometimes in a childish way, are not able to see their parents' pain or their parents' flaws. And I think for Libby, the mother is, the mother's very young. She's in her 30s still, and at it, divorced, and then widowed, in a way widowed, at a time when in the 1970s, like, she's working, she's divorced, and, late 70s, early 80s, there weren't that many families around like that. And there was probably a kind of, women went through a lot of judgment, and, so her life isn't that easy. And there's another woman down the road who's a professional who makes it look glamorous, being divorced. And so there's almost like maybe an element of class. But I think that um, Liz Moore's sort of identification of that the journey of the book is about finding empathy, understanding that people are flawed in their own ways, and trying, there isn't sort of at the end of the novel, there isn't this like sort of everything gets patched up, but I think there is a kind of resolution or coming to terms with that. I think it's also, for me, I felt like the book was a bit of an elegy for that time in your life, for siblings, when you're part of a pack, when you really don't know where your skin ends and their skin begins, because you feel the things that happen to them as profoundly as if it were happening to you. And I'm part of I'm one of 8 children myself, and my relationship with my brothers and sisters, that's something it's really important to me. And I think I wanted to write about the intensity of those relationships and the loss of them, and also female friendships. Like, I think when you're, I don't know what it's like for young men, but I think for me as a teenager, having a best friend was like being in love, and the intensity of those friendships. And, I haven't had that many boyfriends in my life, but the best friends are all part of me. And I can't remember the boyfriends, but the best friends are the people who are part of who I am now. And so I think I also wanted to write a book about that, and maybe a book about America at that time, about maybe the immigrant experience that isn't like everybody else's always, I think there's so many different types of immigrant stories, and I think when we think about the Irish immigrant story, we have a particular like narrative in our minds. And I guess I wanted to write a story that wasn't quite that, that it doesn't always work out for people, and they don't always fit, and the loss of home is something that some people never get over. They can't stop looking back.
That you kind of like made a little bit of a reference to my other question, which was when you were talking about why you wanted to set the book when you did. And I was reading an interview with you from a couple of months ago from the Irish Independent, and you were talking about how in today's culture, like, kids are rarely, even when they're like well into their teens, they're rarely without like parental supervision, or they have their cell phone, and if anything goes wrong, they can immediately reach out to a grown-up to like solve everything. And they might or might not be like safer in general, but you said something along the lines of they've lost the freedom to make mistakes. And that's why I was wondering if that was one of the reasons that you chose the time period that you did to set the book.
Yeah, I do think there was such tremendous freedom at that time growing up. And I don't I know that I haven't given my kids that freedom. And I it's interesting because my nephew is here with us and would see me as a parent, would have like, because he's old enough to have witnessed my parenting. And I'm a frantic worrier. I let them do nothing. So he and my kids, if they were in the room, would be eye rolling me, talking about freedom and the possibility of walking into danger because I've been afraid of that. But I do think that we've lost something and it's not that I don't trust my kids. I think I don't trust the universe sometimes. And I do think that at that time in the 70s, late 70s, early 80s, we did have huge amounts of freedom. And we probably, all of us were in situations we should never have been in. And that's part of like it's part of the growing. And I've quoted this before, but but it's I love the poet Evan Boland, and she has this poem for her daughter called The Pomegranate. And it's really about looking at her daughter and wanting to protect her. She would make any bargain with the god of the underworld, with whomever, like Demeter and Persephone. She would make any bargain to keep her daughter safe. And she's looking at her daughter sleeping and sees the can of Coke and sees the pomegranate seeds. And she just says, if I defer the grief, I diminish the gift. If I take away the pain, I take away the gift of experience. And I do think that we have to, I think we have to watch that we don't take away our children's opportunity to experience pain and to go through things and to, and I think growing up at that time and the time that the book is set, we did get to experience, things. And I think that time is really interesting. For me, it's personally interesting that that cusp of time, like Reagan had just become president in the United States. In England, Margaret Thatcher had just become prime minister, and it's a whole new era of, something shifted between the 60s and 70s in a kind of, I suppose, an idealism that spilled into a lot of political violence. If you think about like the late 60s and into the early 70s. And so there's kind of, a new conservatism and maybe a new kind of prosperity, but also maybe something got lost. And I recently watched Mindhunter. I don't know if anyone saw that. That's part of like my Netflix lockdown. I suddenly watch box, or not even box sets, whatever. I watch obsessively, straight, I'll watch something straight through. But I found that really, that time that they're looking at, and because it does cover the Atlanta child murders and just those things that when you're young, when I was like, I feel like when I was, a similar age to the narrator, that some of those stories, the Manson family or the Atlanta child murders, or even what happened with Jim Jones, in the late 70s, those things that were, you couldn't quite grasp them, but they were there as part of the landscape. So there was a sense of menace and threat.
Yeah, you have the main character, she like always runs past the one house that she thinks is like this Manson house. Yeah. Like, because it just reminds her of the whole story. So she like can't walk by there in the dark. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if anyone else had this kind of like, it was just that, I suppose it was the most shocking thing. And I was old enough to kind of have it register, but not quite understand.
Those are all my questions, and thank you for answering them all. Does anybody else have anything that they wanted to ask or say? Or
I have just a compliment and comment. I mean, I was joking. I'm too old to read a book and not get caught up in the first page or two. And I was hooked after the first paragraph. I mean, I could not put this book down. And one thing that I really enjoyed, these characters are so rich. I mean, I felt like each character had a backstory. Each character had I mean, just great detail and heartbreak. And I just really felt uh, involved in each and every one of them, not just our, protagonist. And I wondered, Una, are these people that are drawn from parts of your life? I mean, are these people you've recreated in the book?
So I think, I mean, they're fictional characters, definitely. I did have a sister that was into punk rock, and I was like emailing her, like, for like, who, what were the bands that you were going to see? But I think the characters, for me, like writing a character, I feel like a lot of times they can become an amalgamation, not just of people I've known, but like of other characters I've read or seen, or I'm probably, I don't know that you can ever have a character that's totally original, because, it's always, I think originality is kind of hard. And like someone like Wilson, so many people I grew up with on Valley Forge Mountain are like trying to like send me messages, and they're like, is this Wilson, or is Wilson this person, or Wilson is, and I'm sort of thinking, like, I think Wilson like lived in every neighborhood. There was always somebody that was a bit like someone maybe quite damaged and broken, but who wasn't. And I think back then our instinct was like, to be afraid or to stay away. And but that, for me, Wilson was like was someone who I didn't really expect to stay in the book. I needed someone at the beginning to go look for Ellen, and he just sort of came in and he didn't leave. He ended up staying for the duration of the book. I think the one character that I've probably, it's not my father, but I've definitely drawn on my father's experience as an Irish immigrant. And because I wrote something that I definitely knew. I grew up cutting grass with my dad. And my dad was an Irish immigrant who really was leaving home was something that really was a wrench for him, and he never really settled in America. And I think the pain of witnessing that as a child and kind of grasping it at some level was something that definitely I did write about in the book. But at the same time, he's a fictional character, and he's not my father. And my father did not die when I was a teenager, or and I'm not Libby, and all those things. But with the characters, like, I think the characters kind of arrive, and they do start doing stuff, and they kind of start to get their own. They become their own people. And as I went through drafts, I guess. I started to feel like Marie wouldn't say that, I started to understand them. Like, so Marie's too strident, and she wouldn't have said something like that. And she would have been a bit more sarcastic, or, so as I went through multiple drafts, I started to get a better sense. And it was interesting to hear the copy editor say, like, I don't think Sage would say this, or, because her sense of who Sage is.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
Hey, Una. Sorry,
Hi,
Chris.
Justin.
Sorry, were you good? Someone's gonna say something. Okay. So, I just wanted to ask you. Obviously, the setting of this novel is one I don't typically read about a lot. Like, so I'm happy to be able to read about southeastern Pennsylvania and see someone try and capture that in fiction. When you think about Pennsylvania, or even specifically southeastern Pennsylvania as a setting, do you have any way in your mind that you sort of characterize it, like what essential characteristics you are either trying to capture when you write about it, or think that other people typically think of when they think of southeastern Pennsylvania? Yeah, if you could just speak to that, because I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts about that.
Yeah, I think I grew up in southeastern Pennsylvania, and being away from it, I think is that displacement is certainly, you know, it's a heartbreak in a lot of ways. You know, I think about that place where I grew up, and the first thing I'm going to say is trees, because uh, because I miss trees, and in fact, where I went to college in Tennessee, I actually, Margaret, who's here this evening, I stayed in her house in a number of years ago, and it was late autumn, and we were walking, and we had to actually walk. The leaves were almost up to my thighs in sections, like waiting, like leaf fall, and I can't explain that except that we don't have that here because all the trees were cut down, you know, by the big houses, you know, and when people were really, really impoverished, you know, the trees were cut. And so they're trying to get forestry back again in Ireland, but southeastern Pennsylvania for me initially was trees. But there's also something about that particular time. And just, I think this is kind of funny. The Philadelphia people will get it. And the Italian book is going to be called Children of the Blue Root. So it's been sold in Germany and Italy. And the Italian editor wants to call it Children of the Blue Root. And initially I was like, no, God, like Valley Forge mountain isn't near the Blue Root. Like that's confused. And then the more I thought about it, I thought like people who grew up in the Philadelphia area in a particular time will know that the Blue Root was like developed, and that's what links us all the way up through that corridor. But I think on top of that, there was, when I was growing up, that, you know, there was King of Prussia is about to become the biggest mall in the world that year. You know, it's being expanded, in the plaza becomes the mall, and for a brief time it's the biggest mall in the world. And the Limerick nuclear plant is being built, and we could see the cooling towers from the mountain. And so to the west was all this rural farmland, but to the east really was industrial and concrete and asphalt. And that there was, so I guess there's an elegiac sense of losing that. But I think as well, there's something about people. And I want to say that someone like Wilson is southeast Philly, like southeast Pennsylvania in my mind. And I always tell this story, and Justin may have heard it before, but when I would come back from Ireland, and that you used to have to go through JFK and then take because there was no direct flights to Philadelphia. And I would land at JFK, take the train into the city, the subway into the city to Penn Station, take New Jersey Transit to Trenton, and then hop on SEPTA to Philadelphia. And all the way, you know, everyone's just behind their papers. And then at Trenton, you get on the train and it's like everybody's talking and everybody's like telling each other, you know, giving advice and do this or don't be doing that. And there was one time there was this kid, he was probably a runaway, who was talking about he was going to train hop across the United States, and the entire train car is like trying to get him back home. And I just thought, like, when I get on SEPTA, I always think I'm home. That like there's that overstepping boundaries, gregarious people. And maybe that's me mythologizing like people from Philadelphia because I'm not there anymore, and I miss it. But every time I go back, I get that same feeling of something open and engaged, and I don't know, sometimes without boundaries, and so with the character of Wilson, like get overly involved and all of that. I just feel like those people don't like. I don't know if that story would sit in another place. Justin, I don't know if that's answered your question.
Yeah, it does. Thanks.
I just wanted to say that during this whole COVID thing, my husband and I have been every single day going out to Chester County and driving our dogs for a ride in the car and a walk. And we started at the beginning of COVID going on 23 through the park, up the mountain, and coming out on the other side of the mountain and coming home through Phoenixville. So, and the other thing is that I went to Conestoga and my husband went to Great Valley. So we grew up on, you know, opposite sides of the mountain, but we've been driving that route every single day for a year. And when I picked up this book, it was like I could see almost every blade of grass in the book. I mean, we pass the water tower and the street, Black Diamond Road, where somebody says, "Oh yeah, the rich people want to make this a private road," and we were driving on that road every single day. So it was like I was living in the book, and it was so amazing because the descriptions of what it looks like there, and the little covered bridge where she jumps out of the car. I I was just, it was a kind of a very, very strange psychic experience to read that book, which I did in like, you know, 2 gulps. It was so wonderful. And Valley Forge Mountain absolutely, absolutely was the place where in high school we all, you know, we all found sort of, you know, it was like in the Shakespeare plays when they go into
The green
nature.
world. Yeah.
Really, really magical in like a scary way, but a beautiful way. And it was just perfect. The explanations of, because the dad had explained to the kids about the plants and they knew so much about the huge bank of rhododendrons that they called the kingdom. I mean, here they had this like this huge castle of rhododendrons, and that was where they went when they were in trouble, when they were in danger. And it's still there. I mean, it still looks just like that. So thank you. It was quite a strange and wonderful experience.
Thank you so much. It's funny that you mentioned the Shakespeare thing. I think that's really interesting about these kind of worlds, these in between, you know, always like in Midsummer Night's Dream or whatever, is that they go into this green world and where everything gets transformed. And I hadn't thought about that. That idea of being of that space of transformation, you know, that happens. But I did. I think the thing about, I thought for a long time about having it be a non-place, not mentioning like specific reference, like it would just be a place. And the more I thought about Valley Forge Mountain, I just thought there's just so much there in terms of like revolutionary history, Lenape history, and then the trees and the horseshoe trail. It was hard to not set it, you know. The first probably 30,000 words, it was in a non-place, and I went back and built the place back in. And I think around 2000 and my niece got married and I was in America, I think maybe 2016, and I just started the book, and I went back to Valley Forge Mountain and I met a childhood friend there. And she had just lost her daughter. Her daughter was 21 and she'd lost her daughter to a drug overdose. And we walked the trail together, and then we walked the mountain. And I don't know, like I just thought that place, and like, you know, I was only lived there for 7 years of my life, but that it was like it was a coming of age space for me. And I just thought, you know, that idea of being on the trail and the yellow rectangles that mark the trail, and you feel like you're on the way home again. And I suppose, you know, you can never get home. You can never get back to that place. You know, we're all trying, you know, I think every writer is trying to write back to home. And you know, I think I was listening, I interviewed a writer a few years ago who's from West Belfast, which is a very, very Catholic area of Belfast, very rough, very sectarian, incredibly impacted by the Troubles. Very, very bright guy who goes to college at Queen's College, and now he lives in another part of Belfast, in South Belfast, and he feels like he can't go home, even though he's only like a mile and a half away. And he watches home. So he started this project where he goes home on Google Maps, and he blogs about it. And over the years, he's just gone back home and looked at the streets where he grew up. I find it like incredibly poignant, you know. I mean, I know he's working on a novel at the moment, but that yen for a place, you know, and I think that's, you know, if I weren't living probably in a different country, I may not feel it so profoundly. Sorry, that's a really long response to I can't see that my eyesight is so Gail. Thank you.
Thank you. It was so perfect. It was so perfect. The descriptions are so perfect. They're in your heart, I can tell.
I have another question. I don't want to hog the floor if somebody else wants to go first. Okay. Una, can you speak to the title and the image of the crooked tree?
Yeah, so I first will say the title was we wrangled over the title. So very few books, very few authors get their original title. And I've discovered that is really, really common, and writers talk about it all the time. So I actually initially called it Gardening at Night, which is an REM song. And even though Gardening at Night was a 1983 song, I just thought, I think because one of the initial images, I really had the image of the child being put out of the car, and I had the final image of a girl trying to cut the grass with scissors, you know, and that the kind of the futility of that image, you know, that trying to control something that's, you know, obviously so completely out of her control. But from the very moment, my editor is Louisa Joyner at Faber and Faber. She's the one who bought the book first, and they bought World English Language Rights, and they sold it to HarperCollins. And she's an excellent editor. She's the editor of Milkman, which won Anna Burns' novel, which won the Booker 2 years ago. She's really, really bright and energetic, and she just said from the moment I spoke to her, she said, that's not going to be the title. So I'm just telling you that if you want to work with me, we're going to change the title. So they had like, one of her suggestions was Bitter Education. It's something that Wilson says this Latin phrase, and it's about, you know, the sweet fruit from a bitter education. And the word bitter just didn't, even though I think bitter is a really interesting word, the bitter part of it just stayed with me, and I just thought I don't want to call it that. And so there was a lot of ideas went back and forth, and then I sent her a list of 10 titles. And at the very bottom, I put a crooked tree because I had the image of the crooked tree was already in the book, and she said that's the title. But I loved that idea that first of all, there are these they're wayfinders. You know, you walk on trails, like in all these trails that we walk they were Native American trails before they were our roads. You know, these Native Americans didn't have pack animals; they walked everywhere, and so one of the things that they would do is that they would bend trees and tie them and reshape them as wayfinders, you know, as you went. So like signage, you know, signposts along trails. And I always, like when I was little, I always thought that was so interesting. But then when you grow up near a forest, you know, the forest is in my backyard, you also see that sometimes a big tree just falls on a smaller tree and rots. And the younger tree survives because it's flexible and it's a sapling and it can bend and is reshaped by that. And I guess I hope it's not too on the nose, as a metaphor, but I liked that idea of that, again, coming back to the children sort of sometimes bearing the weight of what parents aren't able to do, or the failure of parents, so like that they're reshaped by something, but they don't break. And I don't want to, because I know, like, sometimes children aren't resilient, and but I like that idea of that, Libby's sort of imagining where she is in her sapling life, and she sort of understands that she's been reshaped by the events. Yes. If you unmute yourself, you're still on mute, I think.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. I tuned in just a little bit late, so you may have addressed this. What was your journey from living in the Philadelphia suburbs back to Ireland? You already covered that, and if so, I apologize to everybody, but I was interested to hear you talking about how important place is to you, and there you are.
Yeah. So I went to college. So I went to college in the South, and
Sewanee.
when I finished college to Sewanee, and when I finished college, I went back to Philadelphia and I did a master's at Temple University in English. And I had done a year, in my junior year, I did a semester abroad in Ireland, in Galway. And we'd always gone back and forth. My family had always gone back and forth to Ireland. We'd been there, we've been going all of our lives. But from when I went in college, I started going back a lot. I went back immediately after college, and then went to Philadelphia and did the master's. And when I was going back and forth, I feel like a teenager saying this, but I met my husband. He's a musician, and and that was part of, like, I always say to him, like, the biggest love affair of my life is Sligo, not you. It's like, I would have come here anyway, but I had met him, and so he was in London at the time, because emigration was such a huge part of the Irish experience in the 80s and early 90s. He was living in London, and we both agreed to try to move back that we would both move to Sligo, and because we were having this sort of long distance relationship, and that's how I ended up coming back to Sligo. He also, he's a traditional musician. He plays traditional Irish music, and so for him, the decision to come back was also, he's played with the same band for 30 years.
Wow.
Except for the last year, I guess they're in lockdown as well.
Oh, well, this has been an exceptional year. Yes.
So I guess that is how I came here. I did one year. I taught in Savannah, Georgia, at Savannah College of Art and Design, and I actually got married in Savannah. Michael came over, and we got married in the cathedral in Savannah. But I've been in Ireland for almost 30 years, and I can't right now. Like, Justin knows where I am, but the Knocknarea, the mountain, is about 150 meters behind me, and the high tide is about 10 meters in front of me, and I can't describe how beautiful it is where I am right now.
Well, it's clear that you've lost your Philadelphia accent, if you ever had one, because the Irish accent is back in full. I don't think that we forget our original accents.
If I open my mouth in Ireland, like, literally, I'll just say hello, and they'll say, "What part of the States are you from?" Just
really?
Oh, completely.
Oh.
100%. Because what they hear is what they describe it as a twang. They just hear it straight away. And so, yeah. So, and then when I go home, people are like, "Oh, you don't sound like you're from here anymore." So I don't know. But I think it's funny because I lived in Tennessee, and then, like, my closest friends are Southern, and so I still say y'all and five and fine. So I think I don't know where I'm from.
Oh, well, I've lived in Philadelphia for more than 40 years and I still sound like I'm from New York, which is where I was brought up. So people say, you don't have a Philadelphia accent. I can hear New York. So we live with the way we speak, I think. Thank you very much for writing such a wonderful book, by the way.
Thank you. I just take my aunt, who's 87, lives just up the road. I was just telling Lizzie, she just got her vaccine. She's 87, and she in fact, when she went, I was telling Lizzie, she said it was one of the best days out she's ever had, because she knew everybody in the center, and they've all been locked in lockdown for a year. There was a woman with, there was 102, and she said they were all cracking jokes and having, she said it was like the best day. But she's lived here all of her life. She's lived in the exact same location all of her life. And there's a neighbor up the road called Deirdre. And I said something about Deirdre being from Trento, and she said, she's not from here at all. She's a blow-in. But she's lived here for 65 years.
Oh my.
And there's, that sense of, so I'll always be a blow-in as well,
Laura from Scotland, she's an outlander to your community. Yeah.
She's only from Donegal. She's like literally like a few miles up the road, but she's not from here at all. She's a blow-in. It's the phrase that's used.
Okay. Okay.
Right. I have one more question, but first I have to tell you, when I was reading about the kingdom, I had to chuckle because one of my best friends, we grew up on the same street and we had a kingdom. We had this whole you know how little kids do, but we had this whole imagined kingdom, but there were kings and queens in the whole bit, and it'd be like, okay, I'll meet you at the kingdom. That was our little neighborhood play.
You're probably better than us, not smoking cigarettes and.
Well, yeah, we were little. And if there are writers in this group, I apologize. This is probably an ignorant question. When you write and you start this story, do you know the ending? Do you know what's going to happen? Or does it just all of a sudden show up? I've always wondered that, because this is such a fabulous story. And it just comes from this one incident of dropping this child off and how everything, spirals outward from there. Did you know how this was going to resolve itself?
No. And so I know some people are really good at plotting, like, well, they know, like they'll have a map for the entire book. I don't write like that. And I wish I think there would be so much security, if I could, but I don't. And I think I probably wrote, I think I had scenes in mind. And I feel like I was writing scene to scene and I didn't know what was going to happen. I don't know, that image of the girl at the end cutting the grass with the scissors, I knew would be the final image. And I knew the first image would be the child put out of the car on the road at dusk. And I really didn't know what would happen in between. I know I wanted to, look at certain things. And I think there's something positive about that writing into the abyss, the uncertainty and facing that each day. I always try to use Hemingway's edict of, like, when you finish writing, always leave it in a place where you can pick it up the next day. So don't leave it where you're really stuck, but leave it when you're like starting to get in flow, so that the next day you have momentum, to start again. But I definitely had a lot of, I didn't know what was going to happen. And I think I was kind of going from scene to scene. And, I think almost all the writers I know are probably quite similar. One of the things that happened probably after the first draft is I had to get a little bit more, I had to do a chronology. I had to get a little, I had to really make sure that things were cohering in the timeline, and I got much more structured about it. But when I was first writing, I wrote into the dark quite a bit. Which is, hard, I think, but I think there's a lot to be said for it, because the unexpected can happen, and maybe you leave yourself open. I still have a little, not a wobble about the book, but I I still am not really that comfortable with that scene where there's a confrontation with Barbie Man. I said it to both my editors, like it just feels, I wrote it because I just didn't want her to be, I wanted her to act, and I didn't want her to be saved by Wilson. I wanted her to like go and have agency and take charge. But it's still somewhere in my mind felt implausible, or too much of a compensation fantasy of like you get to confront the person that hurt you or assaulted you. And I guess maybe fiction lets us do that, but I didn't expect that to happen, and it happened in the book. But it's still, even now, I wake up some nights in a sweat thinking people will think it's, I'm being judged.
But even the character of Barbie Man with that long hair, I mean, had you had 3 glasses of wine and you were just like, oh, wow.
No, I think that he is kind of based on someone who just an encounter in childhood that was quite terrifying, and my sister always said, about him, we both seen him, she always said that he had hair like a doll, and that the way it was so perfect, and I don't know, that image of having hair like a doll and just being kind of quite like a terrifying stayed with me. My HarperCollins editor wanted me to make him a little bit more, to not make him so much of a specter. He was saying, maybe you could just make him a little bit boring, or like, and I probably struggled to try to do that. The editors were really, they make suggestions, but there was nothing, bar the title, when like Louisa said, the title, that's it. We're not going with Gardening at Night. The whole relationship was very much about suggestions. My Faber and Faber, she puts pencil margin, like she penciled in the margin. She wrote me a long essay, but all the notes on the manuscript were done in pencil, which I thought was like very old fashioned and kind of lovely.
So I'm always kind of tempted to ask this question of artists and writers, because I am kind of interested in how people develop their sensibilities and their styles and everything. So I'm tempted to ask like what writers have influenced you, but like every writer I've heard answer that question or talk about answering that question says they hate it. So I instead now switch it to what writers do you see yourself as in conversation with, and I was wondering if you could talk to that a little bit.
Yeah. So there's so many writers I admire, and I'd like just to like preface it, like I don't want to in any way say that I would compare myself to them, or like I'm just like in awe of what they do. But I think Laurie Moore is an American writer who I guess who will run the Frog Hospital, and I think probably even thematically she's influenced me, as well as her just incredibly spare verse, and just I just think she's a beautiful writer. But she has this little book called Who Will Run the Frog Hospital, about teenage female friendships, and it's just it really resonated with me. I love Raymond Carver still. I love short story. I read a lot of short story writers. Actually, I love Amy Bloom, Amy Hempel. I love George Saunders. Like when I read The 10th of December, I haven't been able to do that yet, but George Saunders writes in the third person, but it's almost, he does this thing that we almost think that we can't do, because his narrator is almost omniscient. It's been like, now we, the 19th century sort of omniscient narrator, we think, well, we don't believe in that anymore. We believe, you can only, if you could do third person close, but you can't be like hopping in and out of other people, different characters. But George Saunders does it, and he doesn't even signal it. You're in one character's head and then you're in another, and it's just done so brilliantly. I am a really big fan of George Saunders. And I think as well, I've loved, like, this book is an older book, but Mary Carr, who wrote a book called Liars Club, which I read in the early 90s, probably maybe it came out in 93. It's a memoir, so it's nonfiction. She's from East Texas, and just like crazy, crazy family. And there was something about like how you could write about how there was something about her, the pathos of like the kind of almost the tragic next to the hilarious, that I loved in her work. I read a lot of Irish writers, obviously, and really, really admire. There's a writer, Colin Barrett, who's had a good few stories in the New Yorker. Kevin Barry. But I suppose just somebody else I should mention. I really love Toni Morrison, and every time I go back, and even though I probably would be afraid to write prose quite like hers, there's something about the heart. Like I think I love that spare verse, that spare line, like a Carver line. But when I read a story, I'm not really interested in like very cerebral stories. I just want someone to like really tug my heart. I want to be moved when I read a story. And when I'm teaching, I find it's always really interesting to teach a story that's cerebral, but like really, I want to read a story that moves, catches me or moves me, and just sometimes even just because of the language it uses. And maybe that's like Toni Morrison. I think, yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, Justin. I should be better prepared for that question about the writers I think I'm in conversation with. But those are writers I feel like have been really impactful. Flannery O'Connor. And it's funny, I was teaching Flannery O'Connor recently, and some of my students were just like really, like Flannery O'Connor is, she said so many racist things in the letters that have come out, and how do you reconcile that? And so it's so, interesting to be like, because I'm teaching in an environment where students are rightly taking, ownership over the curriculum and what we talk about and learn. But when I read a story like Good Country People or A Good Man Is Hard to Find, I just think like she's just this sort of this Southern grotesque idea. I just think she's amazing. That whole Southern Gothic element, the outcasts and misfits. I love those stories. Hi.
I think you're on mute. And
sorry, yeah. And now I think you're off mute now.
Okay, me? All right, well, hello.
Hi.
I'm friends with some old friends of yours, Cindy Burton, Andrea Gordon. Anita,
Yeah.
and I know that you had a discussion with them, and I missed that. So that was a lot of fun, and I know a lot of the way that discussion went. So it was interesting to hear a little bit more about the book than what's being discussed here. But I grew up outside of Reading, which is about an hour west of where you did. And I associated very much with your book, like right away, because we had the same woods. We played outside. I mean, we had our kingdom. And was it the kingdom that was the trees? Was that the circle of trees in which, right. One thing that got me though, is I couldn't figure out how you had sleeping bags and a stash of things that didn't get wet, because we never could find a suitable way to keep things outdoors where the outdoors didn't destroy whatever we were trying to keep safe. And so that's one. And two, that that Barbie man, I know that you said that you wanted to keep him boring, I guess, but I found him quite terrorizing, because I guess since we're more or less the same age and grew up at the same time, I could really see a person like that. And you know, there were the scary times where we were, I mean, stupid kid stuff, throwing stuff at cars, and if they would stop and then run after you, that was really a scary time. And it just reminded me of a Barbie man coming after us. So I was a little, he terrorized me a little bit, even though you tried to keep him boring. But anyway, so I was wondering how you kept all that stuff in the kingdom dry. Because we've always found it impossible.
Well, it was in a waterproof suitcase. The real challenge is because the trying to dig up on the mountain, because of the tree roots, I actually thought it did stretch, you know, believability in terms of trying to get a shovel through all that network of roots.
Right.
Would have been, you know, if you think about like all the rhododendron, laurel, oak, I mean, it's just
Right.
but you're the first person who's asked about not being able to suspend disbelief. The thing about Barbie Man, I actually probably failed in what my editor wanted me to do was just to make him just like some low, as he wrote in the margin, just a low life from Pottstown, just make him like really, you know, just so that he doesn't have this ogre kind of spectral quality, just make him kind of have one or two things that just make him, that normalize him a little bit more. And I didn't know quite how to do that. And so I suppose I think I had him have a rabbit's foot because I just thought, like, how weird, you know, do you remember we had like they were dyed, very bizarre thing that people went around with on their keychains and that time, like a rabbit's foot. Like it's very odd. And I'm sure there's some backstory as to why, but it seemed like a detail that was a bit off. And I think he had like a little pink mirror or something, but I literally couldn't. And my editor is like, my HarperCollins editor is like super cool. Like he's editing 2 books with Quentin Tarantino at the moment. And he did a book with the Beastie Boys. Like he's super cool. And I'm always like, why did he pick this book? You know, how did that happen? But anyway, I'm not sure I succeeded in like, doing what he was asking me to do, which was to, I know what he meant, which was to make him actually just a regular kind of normal guy who's a predator, obviously.
Right.
You know, he is a predator.
Right. That's what I think was so terrifying. And I think that you managed to do that. I mean, he was his own separate character. And I think that he was, I think you did well on that, in that aspect of giving him power, but keep him boring at the same time. But I did find I could relate to that whole piece. I mean, it probably sounds horrible that I was throwing stuff at cars. I didn't mean that. But,
No,
you know, we were chased, you know, at some points, and just to have one constantly come back and be looking for us. I could relate to that. But anyway, I just wanted to touch also with your childhood friends that I've had Zooms with Anita, but I've never met Anita. My daughter has met Anita actually in San Francisco. They all went and took her out to lunch, but I've never met Anita, and Cindy I know quite well, and Andrea is more or less my best friend. So
Cindy and Andrea, I went to high school with. I've never met Anita either, but they went to. So I went to Notre Dame, and they did as well. So
Yeah.
they're and it's been. I've talked to a lot with them over the last few years. Funny enough, my new book is. I'm writing a book set between Philadelphia and Vermont at the moment, and so Cindy lives in Vermont. So I've been chatting to her about things in Vermont things. So
well, with Cindy, you can talk about UAE, you can talk about, because she travels so much and has lived so many places. And I think Creed, her son, is going to be going to Lebanon, and working there, or I don't know if it's an internship or what it is, but if you talk to her next, ask her.
okay, yeah.
So anyway, but thank you. It was a great
Lovely
read.
to meet you. Hi.
Nice to meet you too.
Interesting.
Did anybody else have any questions? I just wanted to say that I think that it's okay if the Barbie man was super creepy, because if you think of it as like someone looking back on their childhood, the person probably is this like larger than life, like ghostly haunting person that really like is in their psyche as like a terrifying person. Even if they were the most normal looking person in the world, they probably have like some sort of qualities like that,
Yeah, I think and also I suppose that the book is supposed to be a little bit there's a few moments where it dips, like where we know that we're looking back, so at the very beginning of the last chapter, I didn't know
Yeah.
then, so that there's a bit of distance.
Well, I also have to say I'm fascinated to know Gwen's our children's librarian and I'm the other librarian, and so we're both reading it and we both went to Catholic all-girls school, and we're both like, what schools are she talking about? I'm gotta ask her, because I went to Marion, so I'm like, is it Marion? Marion's closer to the city. So or I guess
It's funny, I was trying not to have it be like Notre Dame, so I made it closer to the city in case. I have a best friend that I grew up with on Valley Forge Mountain, and she's come to 3 book clubs. And she went to the one in no, she didn't go to the one with Reed's, the bookstore, but she's been to 3 different book clubs. And I feel like at the start of every book club, I have to say, Chrissy's father is not a Southern doctor who had an affair, on like, because everyone associates
that's
me
funny.
with Chrissy growing up.
So I just have a comment, not really a question, because I've kind of just started it because there's so many holes on it at the library, which is a good thing. But I'm really excited because I grew up in Philadelphia, the northeast part, the lower northeast part of Philadelphia. And my cousins actually grew up where I'm living now in West Norriton, and I'm like a mile from Valley Forge. And I really didn't go through Valley Forge until I was an adult, and I used to go hiking a lot with a friend. And now, of course, I'm living out here, and so there's like, I started reading it, and I'm like, immediately, I'm like, oh, I know where that is, or I just really felt like such a connection right off the bat. And I've read other books by other people who wrote about the city or the suburbs, and you just don't get that same feel. So I just wanted to say that the writing is so lovely, and I'm just so excited, and I can't wait to finish reading it.
Thank you very, very much. Thank you everyone so much for coming. Like, I'm really, it's been nice that it's been so intimate as well, like that, we can talk, and thank you. And Lizzie, thank you so much for organizing this and for inviting me. And also,
Oh
I
my
just want to thank
goodness.
Justin, who put us in touch.
Yes, yes, absolutely. This is why I stay in touch with people on Facebook all the time, because then you meet other cool people and it's awesome.
Yeah.
And Margaret from coming all the way from Atlanta, you know. Thank
I didn't
you.
have to come very far. I just hit click. But no, this was great. This was just delightful. I loved the book. I was caught up in the first page, and that doesn't happen very often. So thank you for this. And I've written down the authors and the books that you were talking about. So
I
I'll
did
look at
too.
those as
Yeah.
well.
I did too.
Thank you. Thank you, Liz.
Thank you,
Thank
everyone.
you, Una. It was nice
Thank
meeting
you
you.
so
Bye.
much.
Thank
All right.
you.
Thanks a
Good
lot.
night.
Bye.
Good night.
Bye.
Some sleep.
Yeah.